Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Just want to say thank you for attending today's Aging with Pride session for the 2S LGBTQ seniors and allies, and thanks for our partners at SAGE and the Pride Center of Edmonton. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to acknowledge that we're located on Treaty 6 territory and respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our lives. Just two housekeeping items. As you will have seen, that today's session is being recorded. If you'd prefer that your image not be used, please turn off your camera. And secondly, just to remind you that our meetings are a safe space, or remind you a couple of items. Please respect the speaker by remaining muted during her presentation. We'll unmute you for the Q&A following that. Please be mindful of time limitations and keep your questions and comments as brief as possible so that everyone can participate. Everyone who wishes to will be given an opportunity to ask a question before individuals who have not already spoken, and respect the confidentiality of personal information. So with that, great pleasure. We're just chatting before about history. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Shirley Lowe. She's a local historian who was Edmonton's historian laureate from 2012 to 2014. She has co-authored 2 local histories, edited a third, and produced papers on the value of heritage preservation and Edmonton's urban neighborhood evolution. Her topic is Edmonton, 2 cities, 2 towns, and 2 villages, a historic overview of the 6 municipalities that became part of Edmonton between 1892 and 1964, and considers why these areas grew outside of Edmonton and how they became part of the city. Shirley, definitely want to hear this from you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm here on behalf of the Edmonton and District Historical Society. This is history in the community program. And as Eric was saying, this is going to be a presentation about the municipalities and basically the growth of Edmonton. So I'm going to get into the share screening thing now. And all right, perfect. All right. Okay, so one of the things that I'd like everyone to consider is their own stories in this. Excuse me. A couple of these municipalities will be in the memories of people who have lived here for any significant amount of time. So please feel free to ask any questions or put in your own insights and experiences. All right, let's get started. So we're going to start with why Edmonton was here in the first place. It was a fur trading post. So the first Edmonton house was built in 1795 at the junction of the North Saskatchewan and the Sturgeon Rivers. And it was there because the Northwest Trading Company built Fort Augustus. And they were, the Hudson's Bay Company considered them impinging on their territory. So as they noted in their files that they had built Edmonton House within rifle distance of Fort Augustus. So they both built and were trying to trade for furs at what's probably closer to Fort Saskatchewan than it is to the current Edmonton, but it didn't last all that long. And both of the forts moved on to the second location in 1801. And we used to think that that was at Rossdale, but they've done excavating for all kinds of things. The bridges and whatever else that were in that area, and they found no evidence of the second location. So they think that it's either at the golf course or somewhere in Riverdale, and they're not about to dig up any of that right now. So on to the third. 9 years later, they're at Smoky Lake, and that turned out not to be all that successful either. So 3 years later, they did move into what we consider Rossdale now. The Northwest Company basically imploded at that point. So the Hudson's Bay Company took over all of the operations of the Northwest Company in 1821. So from then on, there was no more Fort Augustus. It was just Fort Edmonton and the Hudson's Bay Company. So we know that the North Saskatchewan River floods on a fairly regular basis, and there were two really huge floods in the early part of the 1800s, and that sent them uphill a bit. So the last Fort Edmonton was where the Bowling Green area is at the Alberta legislature. So that was the fifth and the last Fort Edmonton. So this is a picture or a map of Canada at Confederation, and you can see that that Quebec and Ontario are slivers of what they are now, and the four founding provinces, which would be Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, are the 1867 version of Canada. And what you can see too is that Rupert's Land, which was the land that was chartered to the Hudson's Bay Company by King Charles II, Prince Rupert was his cousin, and he was one of the the owners, I suppose, of the Hudson's Bay Company. And so, sight unseen, and regardless of the people who had already established a life on in this area, the King of England decided that the Hudson's Bay Company would have jurisdiction over all land that had water flowing into the Hudson's Bay. No one had any idea what that was, but as you can see on the map, it was huge. So in 1870, as part of the deal with British Columbia, that would provide them a connection with Eastern Canada, or with Canada at that time, the Dominion had to purchase and work with the Hudson's Bay Company to gain control of Rupert's Land. And they did that. The Privy Council gave them permission to negotiate, and they purchased Rupert's Land for $1 million and 55,000 acres. So part of that settlement was that the Hudson's Bay Company got to set up a reserve around their forts, their current forts, and frankly, a lot of land. 55,000 acres was huge. So 3,000 of those acres were around their fort in Edmonton. And the original Hudson's Bay Reserve was what is now in modern Edmonton, from the river to 118th Avenue, from 101st Street to 121st Street. And as soon as they did that in 1870, the people started to claim the river lots around it. And now remember that the Dominion surveyors didn't arrive in Edmonton until 1882. So basically they were squatting on this land. It was all of it outside of the Hudson's Bay land would have been Dominion land at that point. But they were establishing their territories, which were the river lots. And the river lots, if you notice that the Hudson's Bay Company Reserve is a big rectangle. Well, river lots have a different plan. They run perpendicular to the river, so they get wonky. You can see, and I think you can see how they narrow off towards the top. The river lot rules for the Edmonton area was that north of the river, the river lots were even numbers, and on the south side they were odd numbers. So we start with the cities. The first city, of course, was Edmonton, and the Edmonton settlement worked to or establish itself just east of 101st Street. If you're wondering why our city hall and all our municipal government departments are mostly, or were mostly, east of 101st Street, was because the Hudson's Bay Company had the land west of it. And so the Hudson's Bay Company in 1881 established or subdivided their first portion, and that was from the top of the bank to a road that they dug out and called Jasper Avenue. And Jasper Avenue was named after a fur trader who had never seen Edmonton, in fact, was dead by this time. But it was on the way to a town or a settlement called Jasper, and it was a fur trading post as well. So the Hudson's Bay Company subdivided their portion on the grid. They were the first urban developer in the Edmonton area, and they were the ones who demised their portion into a grid formation. So in the 1890s, you can see that Jasper Avenue was primarily wooden facades. It was almost a temporary town. 1891, the first train arrives. Now, the problem with the train was that the Carleton Trail, which was between Fort Garry and Fort Edmonton — Fort Garry is Winnipeg — was the main highway of the fur trade. It was a very busy roadway or trail, I guess, and so it was thought that when the train was being, or the route of the train was being determined, that would be the natural way to go, because the Yellowhead, of course, is an easier pass than the southern one. And but that didn't happen for two reasons. One was that the memory of the American invasion was, or at least the threat of the American invasion was primary, and so the Dominion wanted to make sure that they established their own territory or turf rights by having the train run as close to the border as possible. On the other hand, the Canadian Pacific Railway, the investors wanted to trade with the Americans, so it worked out that they took the southern route, and that was a great disappointment for the Hudson's Bay Company and for the settlement of Edmonton in 1881, which was the year that the train arrived in Winnipeg. And but 10 years later, the train comes up from Calgary, the Calgary-Edmonton Railway, and arrives on the south side. Now, the Canadian Pacific Railway refused to go across the river. And as they had done in Calgary, they came in, and the settlement of Calgary was on the opposite side of the river, and they basically forced the settlement over to the train side. But the Edmonton people wouldn't go over. So that was the issue there. 1892, Edmonton became a town. It had a population at that point of 700 people. The train arrives and Edmonton grows. So 1900, the Edmonton Bridge, which is now the low level — it didn't become the low level until there was a high level, and it was built in 1900. In 1902, the Edmonton, Yukon, and Pacific Railway crossed the river over that bridge. And it was the low-level bridge was basically a gift from Wilfrid Laurier and company, mostly because Edmonton voted Liberal. You'll find that there are a lot of political gifts that happen and continue to happen, actually. So Edmonton became a city in 1904. The population by then had risen to over 8,000 people. Now, I didn't take the F out of the Canadian Northern Railway. It arrived on 104th Avenue in 1905. And this was the first direct connection, in a national connection. So now the area had two connections, two transcontinental connections railway connections. So number 2 arrives 1905. The city of Edmonton gives them some land on 104th Avenue, and they build their first train station in the city on the west side of 101st Street. So if you remember where the casino was and where the rail yards and the freight yards were, that was the first railway station in Edmonton, on the Edmonton side. Next, that was the same year that Alberta became a province. And in 1906, because Rutherford had become premier, was a Liberal, we became the capital of Alberta. So that was the third connection, the third national or transcontinental connection, was 1909 when the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway arrived. Now, both of these railways, the Canadian Northern and the Grand Trunk Pacific, came in on the north side of the river. So this established the Edmonton side, or the north side, now as the dominant side. Boom. 1910-12 was the height of the real estate and building boom. The city's population by 1912 had grown to well over 53,000 people. This was the era of great immigration. It was also the time that the city built everything, all of its founding infrastructure, its roads, its subdivisions, its streetcar expansion. The first streetcar was in 1908. The brick and stone buildings replaced the wooden buildings. So in the middle photo there on the top, that's 1910 Jasper Avenue at 101st Street. So you can see that I don't know how many, if anyone remembers the old Empire block. It burned in the mid-60s and was replaced by the Empire Building, which is there now. It was the McDougall Secord business building, and they built both of them. Several things happened. Of course, there was the McDougall Hill was very difficult to climb. So even if the Edmonton Yukon Pacific Railway came over the bridge and ended up at the bottom of the hill, they still had to get horses and carriages and up the hill. So the funicular went up to the top and ended up at 101st Street. What you see at the top left is McDougall Church, and the funicular went up there. These are all basic photos of that era. So basically the 1910-12 was probably our biggest boom. Our population literally tripled in 2 years. Okay, so the institutional buildings, legislature was built, and you can see at the bottom in the middle, the legislature is under construction. That's about, it opened in 1912, so that's probably about 1911. Okay, the second city would be Strathcona. So the Calgary-Edmonton Railway, as we said, arrived in 1891. The photo on the left is basically the original train station. That would be in front of what the new 1905 train station is. It would be the northeast corner of 103rd or Gateway and White Avenue. And then of course kitty corner to that was with the South Edmonton Hotel, which became the Strathcona Hotel. So the Canadian Pacific Railway decided it was going to build a competitive settlement on the south side, and it did what the Hudson's Bay Company did. It dug out a main road, called it White Avenue after William White, who was a vice president of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and was the man who basically brought the Canadian Pacific Railway into the Edmonton area. The settlement grew enough that in 1899, South Edmonton became the town of Strathcona. So 1902, these are sort of significant things. There were a lot of fires on the prairie we can, not much has changed. So different towns, Lacombe actually burnt down at one point. So Strathcona decided they were going to create a bylaw banning wooden buildings. Just to give you, I think some of you will recognize top left as White Avenue. There's the map of Edmonton and Strathcona, and then on the bottom is the map of now the city of Strathcona in 1907. The middle top, it was the city hall, and that was where McIntyre Park is now. The building is gone, but it would have been on the probably where the fountain is, or the replica of the fountain. And then of course, as the town and city grew, that's what it looked like on the bottom. So became a city in 1907. And then in 1912, Strathcona built the area's first library. So the Strathcona Library is the oldest library in Edmonton. 1910, it became obvious because of the railways on the north side that that's where you needed to be, and so the Canadian Pacific Railway decided that they would now build the bridge over the North Saskatchewan, and of course they built the first bridge that would connect top of bank to top of bank. You didn't have to go deep into the valley. It was basically a straightforward over the top of the bank, and probably where the narrowest part of the river is. Now, it was also the first bridge in Canada that had 4 different transportation types. So it would have on the bottom deck was pedestrian and at that time carriages and even some cars. Our first car arrived in 1904, so there were cars by 1912 or 13 when it opened. And the top deck had the Canadian Pacific Railway, the big train that ran down the center, and on both sides of it were the streetcar tracks. So the streetcar and the trains ran on the top deck, and people and vehicles were on the bottom deck. 1912, the citizen. Now, you'll notice, I think, one of the things that becomes obvious about amalgamating municipalities is that there's always a dominant municipality, and then there are competing municipalities who grow quickly and can't afford their own infrastructure because they're competing for labor and they're competing for materials. And so generally what happens is that they amalgamate so that they can get a better deal on their infrastructure and they can grow without bankrupting themselves. And this is what happened to Strathcona in 1912. The citizens actually, narrowly decided that they would become part of the city of Edmonton. Okay, we're going to go to villages because that's the chronologically the next. These are the next events. So the village of North Edmonton, which is now the Fort Road area, became an important place in 1905 when the Canadian Northern Railway came through and the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. And basically, both of the railways converged there. And that made it a good place to build the packing plants and also the stockyards. So in 1908, Swifts comes in and they build a packing plant. The Transit Hotel is built. My favorite, this is the pig herd is one of my favorite photos. We see a lot of cow herds, but pigs too. They got off the train and had to walk to the stockyards. 1911 to 13, Burns builds their packing plant, And the Edmonton stockyards became so important in that area. They were the second largest in North America. Only Chicago's Union stockyards were larger on the continent. Okay, it was, I think most of us know that it became the packing town. And same kind of thing. You can see that this was a settlement that grew around the packing area, and it had no amenities. There was no running water. There were no sewers. There were no telephones. None of the things that the city had. It was an inexpensive place to live, but again, no amenities. And so, in order to get those amenities, they decided that they were going to amalgamate with the city of Edmonton. So 1912, again, and Edmonton was quite happy to take them at that point because the packing plants were a huge economic boost. The village of West Edmonton, we know now as Calder. And I know we don't think of Calder as West, but it was at that time. And the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway came in. It located on 127th Avenue, which again was north of 118th Avenue. So it wanted to stay out of the Hudson's Bay Reserve, and it set up its headquarters on 127th. So in 1908, there was a tent city that grew around their freight yards and all of the buildings that the Grand Trunk Pacific put up. So it was decided that 1910 that the village would grow there, and it was established as a village at that point. And I guess it's called Calder because the Calder Land Company was formed in 1907. So Hugh Calder and his partner began marketing 160 acres of West Edmonton Village. And they were offered at $175, or if you wanted a corner lot, you would have to pay $224. And so there were about 500 people that became residents almost immediately. Calder's Bronx subdivision went on sale in 1912. So this was a subdivision. It was next to the original one. 1,200 lots were sold in 3 days for $400 each. So big money. The village was registered as West Edmonton, and it was again called Calder. In 1915, they didn't have sewers, electricity, city water, or telephones. And they began negotiations to merge in 1913, and the city of Edmonton really didn't want them. 1913 was an economic crash. And all of the Edmonton itself, one of the reasons that people would live in places like Calder and surrounding municipalities was because they couldn't afford to live in Edmonton. There was a lot of land speculation, and people were flipping properties constantly. The city had serviced a large number of lots, not all of them, but a large number. And so people in the Calder area in the village of West Edmonton wanted, I think, more even than sewers and water. They wanted the streetcar. And so it was negotiated. And finally, in 1917, the second last year of the war, the Edmonton took over the Calder area. So towns. These are more recent. So the first town was the town of Beverly. And its story begins at the bottom of Grierson Hill. A man named William Helmerstone and his wife Beata were mining. If you know the history of McDougall Hill and Grierson Hill, it's basically punctured full of coal mining. Well, I suppose they're tunnels because they really weren't shafts. They were tunnels. You would just drill into the side of a hill, put up a few wooden supports, and dig the coal out and run away. And it was there that Humberstone built the coal mine, and he actually had a brickyard as well, and all at the bottom of what is now Grierson Hill. So 1899 was one of our famous floods. The river came up and took out the Humberstone coal mine. It also took out the Humberstone house, and the town of Edmonton in 1900 was starting to put the restrictions on coal mining in the town itself, because what it was doing is it was compromising the hill. In 1901, Grierson Hill was a major landslide. It took out half the hill. It just crumbled to the bottom of and into Rossdale. So that was the end of mining on Grierson. And so William and his wife Beata and their investors went east, and they claimed the property south of what is now 118th Avenue, east of 34th Street. And the Clover Bar seam is probably the largest coal mining, or the coal seam in the area. It's absolutely huge, and frankly, it's still there. I mean, Edmonton sits on a lot of coal, and there was a Clover Bar mine across the river, and they started the Humberstone mine. Now, there were up to 500 mining operations in that area. A lot of them were seasonal. People would come in, they dig a tunnel, they grab some coal, decide it wasn't worth it, and run away. So, but there were 3 major operations that stayed for quite a while, and had a big impact on what Beverly was. They were the Bush mines, the old one, and the Bush Davidson mines, and Davidson was important because he subdivided the village and town of Beverly. And then, of course, coal mining, the Beverly coal mine was a whole other story. So 1913, the village of Beverly was incorporated, and in 1914, it became a town. Now, the east, or the western boundary of Beverly was 50th Street. So that was the end of Edmonton and the beginning of Beverly. So if you crossed 50th Street, you were either in Edmonton or in Beverly. Coal mining was the main industry. Agriculture included market gardens and fox and meat farms as well. Edmonton sits on some of the best black dirt in North America. And so farming is, and especially market garden farming, you can be quite successful on very small acreage. Okay, so 1920, well, I'm going to back up a bit here. Hang on. Oh, I'm going to tell you the story of their first town hall. That's what you see in the large photo there, and it was built in 1917 and designed by the architect Alan Jeffers, who was also the architect for the Alberta legislature. One of the big issues with this building was that it was built in 1917, and there was a labor shortage and a materials shortage because it was the war, and the war had been going on for 3 years at that point. So I think there were some construction compromises. Now, they did use the second story as a dance hall and an event place, and the theory is they kind of danced the building to death. On the bottom was the town hall, or of course and also the jail, as well as they had a pen at the back for stray horses and cows and pigs and anything else that arrived that wasn't supposed to be hanging around town without somebody looking after it. And and there was also the magistrate's office, the Alberta magistrate. So Emily Murphy used to hold court in this building. Of course, as I said, it was compromised and had to be demolished eventually. Now, in 1920, the Beverly had sent quite a few men to war in 1914, and several of them didn't come back. So they built the first memorial cenotaph in Alberta. This is now a designated cenotaph, municipal cenotaph, and it has it has federal importance as well. It is the oldest in Alberta. The Beverly Mine, the Depression. Well, I guess we'll back up a bit, because by 1927, the city of Edmonton had changed its buildings over to natural gas, and it was sort of the beginning of the end for coal. The Depression was a big deal because the life of the town depended very much on coal, and at that time there was no safety net. There was no provincial safety net. If you were a family that had lost its income, who couldn't support itself, or even an individual, what you had to do is you had to go to the town council and you had to make a case for help. And this was virtually every time. So if you needed help in May, you would go again in June and July and August. And basically it was a begging mission. They would give you whatever small amount they could afford. And of course, this was very difficult on municipalities, because many of them didn't have incomes, and Beverly was one of those. So the scheme came up. They were going to build a coal mine, and the town and the coal miners and everyone else were going to get investment certificates. They were going to get the vouchers, and that's how they were going to be paid out of the proceeds. Now, the Beverly mine was a big mine, and you can see it has a tipple. The tipple is the big tower, and it's basically a sorting device. So this is where the shafts come in. They dig a shaft down into the earth, and then they build tunnels that extend from the shaft. And they have an elevator system that basically brings people and coal up and down into the shafts, or into the tunnels. And so the Beverly mine was where Jubilee Park is now, which is on the north side of 118th Avenue. And they built several tunnels out. A lot of them. Edmonton also has a high water table, so not surprisingly, it flooded, and there was they did bring up coal, but by the time they got going, it was too late. They lost a lot of money, and of course the miners didn't get paid. It was in 1938, the province of Alberta, the town basically went bankrupt. And so the province of Alberta took over the administration until 1949, when they were able to get their town council back up. However, if the post-Second World War, we had a boom again, and we'd had a housing shortage all through the war. The Americans had been in Edmonton from 1942, and we'd had an exploding economy. We didn't go into a recession in the Second World War, because the Americans not only brought their military, but they brought 10,000 support workers, and a lot of money got left here. So again, people couldn't afford to buy land and property in Edmonton, so they moved out to the surrounding municipalities. There was a huge population explosion in Beverly in the 50s. They couldn't afford their infrastructure, so they became part of Edmonton in late 1961. As one of the business owners at that, who remembers that, tells the story of going into the Beverly Heights Community Hall for New Year's Eve in Beverly and coming out in Edmonton. Town of Jasper Place. So 1910, Jasper Place was mostly a farm area. And its homes, again, had no water, sewer, electricity, or telephone services. The city of Edmonton at that point was in a boom period. And again, speculators had raised the cost of property, and they were asking Edmonton to amalgamate. And Edmonton said, no, you're too expensive, we can't afford you. So they didn't. What they did do is they moved the border from 142nd to 149. So they basically took the high-end real estate. And so in 1912, the 1913, the western border of Edmonton was 149th Street. And if any of you drive down Stony Plain Road and you see that turnabout on the south side, just east of 149th Street for the bus, that was the end of it. Those of us who grew up in this city and had those little green bus tickets remember taking an adventure tour down to the end of the city and then trying to convince the bus driver that we were too little to walk back home again. So it always worked. There was the okay, so anyway, the residents lobbied again for me for the amalgamation, and they kept doing this. Of course, that didn't happen. Again, same as Beverly, the population exploded after the Second World War for the very same reasons that it exploded in the first place. Was there was no decent property values in the city of Edmonton, and so it was always a municipal district, in the same way that Sherwood Park will never become a town or a city because they need the taxes from the industrial area. They will always be part of a county, and that's what was going on with Jasper Place, is that they were part of the county rather than than incorporating until 1950. And it looked like they were going to win this game because people were moving out, and there are all of those suburbs that attach themselves to the center of Jasper Place. And if you drive through the Jasper Place area or west of 149th Street, you'll see that there are a lot of 1950s subdivisions. And that was part of this huge explosion. So the population had doubled. It was almost 9,000 people. It was advertised as a young giant. It was actually the biggest town in Alberta. It was huge. I mean, you know, when you have 9,000 or 10,000 people, you really could be a city, and they were still a town. And they were famous for late night shopping and for their industrial areas. Now, at that time in the 60s and prior, the city of Edmonton closed down. They had a bylaw where they closed down their shops at 5:30 or 6. And the only night you could stay open was it was Thursday night. And so you couldn't shop on Sundays, you couldn't shop in the evenings, except Thursday. And there was a time even prior to that where the big stores, the downtown basically closed on Wednesday afternoon, so that so their staff had that half day off so they could work Thursday evening. But Jasper Place became famous for its late night shopping. They stayed open till 8 o'clock every night. And it drew a lot of people from Edmonton because, you know, they come home from work, they have to pick up stuff, so off they go to Jasper Place. The same issues. They didn't have paved streets, they didn't have sewers, they didn't have telephone, they didn't have any of that, electricity or any of that. Well, they had very limited amenities, and that area has a lot of clay. So it became quite famous as the mud town. But they kept building. So 1963, the Jasper Place High School. And finally, in August of 1964, they convinced the city of Edmonton to amalgamate. So here's a map of the annexations going back to 1899. And as you can see, it includes, of course, the municipalities. And then this is I have to apologize, this is an older map. I couldn't find one that was a little more current, where it says proposed. That's already part of Edmonton. That's the part that Edmonton just took in through the Leduc County area. So the Edmonton boundaries have not remained the same since 1982. So any of the dark blue areas have come in since 1982, and that's the bottom part. we were talking about, I think at one of my presentations, if somebody said, well, you know, what's the footprint of Edmonton? Well, to 1982, the footprint of Edmonton was 525 square miles. If you compare the population to the city of San Francisco, which has the same population, they are 49 square miles. So we have a lot of land that isn't residential. Okay, so thank you for staying awake for most of this. And if there are any questions or any comments, I'd be happy to hear them.
Thank you so much for that, Shirley. Wondering if you could stop sharing your screen so that we can see the places. But I see Joan has a comment in the chat. Would you like to talk to that, Joan?
Yes, I never knew my birthplace for many years, and as a single mom with 2 small children, I found out that Edmonton was actually my birthplace, and I had never lived in the city, but I did come to live in the city from the rural areas of Alberta in the 90s, and I was always very proud of it, and I would go around to anybody who would listen and say, it's Edmonton, it's my town, I was born here. It's an awesome city.
Thank you.
Do you know what hospital you were born in? Did they give you that?
The Miz.
The Miz, I was going to say, I bet it was the Miz.
Yeah, my daddy was a coal miner. He was a bad boy. He disappeared.
Yeah, the Miz.
Jan, yeah. Go ahead. Jan, I see you have your hand up.
Oh, Shirley, were you finished commenting to Joan?
I was just going to say that the Miz, of course, was on 111th Street, 99th Avenue at that time. It didn't move to the west until 1969. So it was, but it was the maternity hospital. It was, yeah.
But if I may, I have so many questions, Shirley, but I'll just try a couple if there's time. When Strathcona didn't make it as a town, would it because they weren't Liberal and didn't receive a grant from the government for their infrastructure?
Oh, no, I mean, Rutherford was a Strathconian. As a matter of fact, the reason that the university was in Strathcona was the university city. It became a city in 1907. The reason that they amalgamated was because they started to boom and they couldn't afford all of their infrastructure. So the deal that they made with Edmonton was that they would get all their streets paved before Edmonton did. And so Strathcona was paved, all the suburban, well, as much as suburban happened in 1912, before the suburbs in Edmonton were paved. Now, the downtown of Edmonton was paved early on. It was paved way before 1910, but it was Rutherford was a Liberal. He was the first premier of Alberta, and it was the reason that Edmonton became the capital city of the province. He was also, as you know, the first chancellor of the University of Alberta, and there was a competition between Calgary and Edmonton at that time about who would get the Alberta University. And so Rutherford promised that neither Calgary or Edmonton would get the university. So he built it in the city of Strathcona. And actually it was a town of Strathcona at that time because it was 1908. So it was the city of Strathcona. So that's how we got the University of Alberta.
Is there time for one more, Eric?
I think so. I have a question though. Or just a rough comment is I grew up in Montreal, and so in Quebec, I know that, if you were driving in the country, you were driving on a beautiful paved road, and suddenly it would end and become a gravel road, and you knew that's where the voting line ended. I wasn't aware of the fact that so many of the same things happened in Western Canada. So good on that. And I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump in with that. But Jan, did you have another question?
Yeah, I did. Shirley, we saw pictures of brick buildings throughout your presentation, would most of those bricks come from J.B. Little's Brickyard, his brick company?
There were a whole bunch of brick companies, lots of them. And as a matter of fact, I have a book on all of the Alberta brickyards. There were a lot of masons. They had a lot of skills. They brought them from Europe and the eastern cities. But there was the Pollard Brickyard was where on the south leg of the LRT bridge. Now there was the Sanderson Brickyard. There was the Riverdale or the J.B. Little Brickyard. And even when we were saving the Gibson block, a lot of those buildings have two brick walls. You know, they have an interior brick wall and an exterior brick wall, and the brick walls are huge, right? And the exterior brick wall came from the Medicine Hat area. So that's where they had better clay, frankly. But a lot of the brick buildings, especially the more orange the brick is, the more local it is. And they were, the brickyards came and went, but they were, Little was a long time brick company. So was Pollard. Sanderson, unfortunately, was killed at his brickyard, so that was the end of that one. But Little was a big deal. And
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more quick question, if anybody. Karen, I see you waving your hand.
I worked for a while in Calgary, and while I was there, this goes back to the competition between Edmonton and Calgary. What I was told about the University of Alberta was that the premier was in a bind, and he made a political promise that the University of Alberta would be established south of the river. And that apparently swayed people, but they didn't realize that Calgary, I think this is the root cause of the antagonism with Calgary and Edmonton, because they felt that they were taken by that ruse. So it was,
a whole bunch of causes even earlier than that. One was that the train went to Calgary and didn't come to Edmonton. And then, of course, the various conservative governments that were, so it was always, it's a big deal. Yes, the university didn't help.
Wonderful. Jan, go ahead.
I just could hear all day, Shirley. I'm just loving your presentation. Who owned the railroads?
Okay, well, the railroad stories. The Canadian Pacific, the Calgary Edmonton Railway was a subsidiary, basically the real estate arm of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and they were an investment group. Now, all of the railways, I don't think there's any major industry in Canada that didn't start out with huge piles of public money and lots of land settlements. Like, so the land right of way, right, wherever a railway is, they own that land, and the only jurisdiction is federal. Okay, so the city of Edmonton has absolutely no jurisdiction over any railway land. And as it doesn't have any jurisdiction over the university land. So the Canadian Pacific Railway came up in 1891. The Canadian Northern Railway and Grand Trunk Pacific in 1905, 1909. Again, they were investments, right? These were groups of people who put in money, got huge grants from the from the government, and pushed the railway through. It was a big deal because it basically opened the land up for settlement. And because, before that, if you were on the Red River cart, first of all, you didn't take a Red River cart, you walked beside a Red River cart, and you walked for 3 months. So if you need to hike to Winnipeg, take lunches for 3 months. There's but the railways went bankrupt. The Grand Trunk Pacific in 1916. And then the Canadian Northern and the Dominion of Canada, the Canadian government amalgamated them all into the Canadian National. So they became a government. They became a government industry until they were sold to the Americans in the 90s.
Wonderful. Shirley, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I need to talk to you, but I think you should come back for next season because your knowledge of Edmonton is so fantastic. And I've lived here for 40 years, and as I walk around, I can see the changes that have happened in the city in the time that I've been here. But it's always so interesting to look back and think, how did that get to be there? So I'd really like to invite you back for next season to chat a little bit more. This has been absolutely fantastic. I'd like to thank you very much. And thank everybody for attending. Just a reminder that next week we've got Aaron Lafuente, who is going to talk about estate planning, a very important component for anybody of a certain age, shall we say, not our age, but of a certain age. So please join us then. And Shirley, I'm going to invite you into a breakout room just so that we can have a quick chat afterwards. This main room will stay open until about 10 after or 15 after noon. If anybody wants to chat among themselves. What else have I forgotten to say? I think that's about it. Jan, any final comments?
Unless Shirley has a last word or an event to advertise.
Yes, please.
Okay, I just want to thank everybody for showing up. I know it's the middle of the day and people have the lives, and I understand, and hopefully that people will watch the presentation again. Again, if you haven't considered it, the Edmonton District Historical Society does really good work in the community and runs a festival in July that takes you through free tours and into some important buildings as part of their Heritage Festival. So put that on your calendar, look them up, see if you want to join, be part of that. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for attending. Really appreciate wonderful, wonderful presentation.